Hello and welcome to the Feedpad and Contain Housing webinar. Today we'll be showcasing the recently developed industry resources to help farmers and service providers make informed decisions in their infrastructure investments. My name is Ashley Black. I'm a project manager working with Clare, Australia, and we'll be facilitating this session today. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. We have 5 great speakers for you today from across the industry and a Q&A panel to answer all your questions at the end. So throughout the webinar, if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please pop them in the Q&A box and we will answer during the panel. Any questions we don't get to today, we will follow up with you offline after the session. So our first speaker for today is Simon Scowen, the manager of Manning Valley Dairy in Wingham, New South Wales, who's currently transitioning into a loose housing facility. Over to you, Simon.
We manage Manning Valley Dairy at Wingham on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. We're about 3.5 hours north of Sydney. Next slide, please. Our farm covers 300 hectares, of which about 240 hectares is effective milking area, and we irrigate about half of that area along the beautiful river flats, as we have a 7-kilometre frontage to the mighty Manning River. Next slide, thanks. Here we milk 800 cows and supply Woolworths direct under the farmer's own label. Next slide, please. We have supplied Woolies now for the last 8 years. Next slide, please. We also join many of our cows to Wagyus and rear around 600 calves annually until they are around 12 months of age, at which they are 300 kilos in live weight. And we sell them to various feedlots around New South Wales and Queensland. The Wagyu beef program is something that we've been doing on the farm for over 20 years. Next slide, please. We live in a beautiful part of this country and we absolutely love where we live. Next slide, please. But the last 4 years have certainly tested us. We've always been an intensive farm at 4 cows per hectare, and we don't make much on-farm silage. Rather, we eat the grass when it grows and we rely on bought-in hay, commodities and grain when it doesn't. In 2019, we experienced the 1 in 100-year drought. Next slide, please. This is the Manning River at its normal flow. A great place to fish, canoe, and a beautiful to have on our doorstep. But in 2019, it stopped flowing. We could actually walk across the Manning River, the first time in history that has been recorded. We were worried about our stock water and where we were going to get our stock water from. We reduced our numbers and we had to purchase a lot of feed in at ridiculous prices. Here on the coast, freight is a major component of all the feed that we buy in, as there is a large mountain range between us and where all our feed supplies come from. Next slide, please. Then we experienced the worst bushfires the area has ever seen. They came close to us but didn't directly affect us. But they did disrupt the supply chain of the bought-in feed that we so desperately rely upon. Next slide, thanks. With the many road closures, trucks just weren't prepared to cart feed to us for the risk of being stuck in roadblocks, but we got through. Next slide, thanks. They say a good flood always breaks a drought. And in March of 2021, we got an absolute doozy, like many others up this way. As you can see, our normal river height is around that 1 to 2 metres. At 3 metres, we pull our pumps out of the river. And as you can see, on the 20th of March 2021, it peaked at 18.4 metres within 24 hours. Next slide, thanks. All our river flats had recently been sown. All the ryegrass plants were about 4 to 5 centimetres tall and they all got plucked out. Next slide, thanks. Our irrigation infrastructure along the river, as you can see there, a lot of it got ripped totally out of the ground. Next slide, thanks. We have a diesel pump, which was pulled up to the mark of the 1976 flood, which was the last 1 in 100-year flood. The water level went 2 metres above that, and that's our diesel pump 400 metres down the river. Next slide, thanks. Our electrical switchboard was mounted on a flood stand. It too didn't bear the brunt of this flood. Unfortunately, no insurance companies cover floods, so we had to have a think about the future direction of our farm. Land prices around here are edging $20,000 an acre. And we are on a river bend with a manning on 3 sides of us and the township of Wingham as our neighbour on the 4th side. So we now needed to replace all our irrigation infrastructure. So we decided to install 7 centre pivots. With our experience of the drought, only one of these pivots would now be affected by one of these 1 in 100-year floods. Our river flats are beautiful alluvial sandy loam country. We're grazing and using the bike shift. We used to utilise about 12 to 14 tonne per hectare per year. Next slide, thanks. With the pivots, we can now double crop. We can grow a 24 tonne corn silage crop and then follow that with a 10 tonne to the hectare ryegrass crop. So we've now trebled the feed harvested from our irrigation area, but now we need somewhere to feed this feed. So we looked at the pros and the cons of housing our cows. Our milk heads daily to Sydney and the excess goes up to Brisbane. This market is only increasing, yet local supply is decreasing. Next slide, thanks. So why intensify and build a compost barn? So this barn will help us reduce our exposure to these extreme weather events. In a flood and wet weather, it will allow us to keep our cows out of the mud and maintain our production in the droughts. It will allow us to get more value out of our feed, especially our bought-in feed. We'll have a less reliance on this bought-in feed. And now that we've been able to treble our production on our river flats, this silage can be put into the cows to increase the cow production. A lot of the farms that we've spoken to that have gone down this path have seen cow production increase by greater than 40%, as we're taking away a lot of the stresses that we are currently placing on our cows. For example, our cows will walk up 2.5 kilometres to our furthest paddock and then another 2.5 kilometres back to the dairy. With them sitting right beside the dairy, they won't expel this energy into walking, and this energy can then be put into milk. This all leads to a higher feed conversion ratio. We'll get a lot more milk out of the same feed, and especially the expensive feed that we have to buy in. This will all combine to a lower cost of production, which is what we need as the economics that face us with higher input costs in the future. Also, the carbon calculators rely upon calculating production from a certain area. As we'll be increasing our production from our area, this will lower our carbon footprint. Also, we will now be capturing all the effluent that the cows produce, and this will provide a valuable fertiliser source and reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilisers. Next slide, thanks. As farmers, we spend more time with our cows than with our kids. Just like with our kids, we only want the best for them. And it's certainly broken our hearts to see the conditions that we have had to endure the last couple of years along with our animals. If this is climate change and what we have to get used to, then we need to do better by our cows. By putting them in the shed, we will decrease the heat stress. It gets pretty hot up here and humid in our summer times, and we're going to get a lot of summer storms. And as you can see, that's not a very pleasant environment to be living in. We get a lot of mastitis, we get a lot of lameness, and it's definitely harder to get cows in the calf. So by housing our cows and reducing the stress on them, they'll last longer, and also the calves will be a lot healthier. So our milk quality will only increase. Somatic cell count is a measure of our milk, which determines the shelf life of our milk. If the cows are a lot healthier and less mastitis, our cell count will lower, and this will make our milk a lot more attractive to our customers. At the moment, we can't join in the summertime as it's just too hot. So by having them in the shed, we'll be able to join 12 months of the year and produce a flat production curve, which is exactly what our customers require. Next slide, thanks. Staff is the #1 issue facing many farmers in our industry. This form of farming makes it a lot easier to manage staff and retain staff. It's a lot easier to plan and budget on what you're doing from day to day, from week to week and month to month. Tasks become a lot more repetitive. Therefore, it's easy to have consistent procedures and protocols for. Also, a lot pleasant working environment. Next slide, thanks. This is definitely a new look for dairying in Australia. And just as we have seen many advantages of going down this pathway, the same will be for many other farmers. The economics force farmers to become bigger and bigger. This form of farming we see will only become more and more common within our industry. But every farm is different, and the decision each farmer will take will be different, depending on the drivers in their business. It's not a cookie-cutter design. Farmers will decide whether they put in a dry loft, a free stall, or a compost barn. We decided on a compost barn, mainly because the shed can be a multi-purpose shed. So it doesn't always have to house cows. As you can see, this area could be housing, parked trucks under there. Could house horses. We could grow tomatoes. Might even be able to grow medicinal marijuana. Who knows? Also, we think it looks a lot more natural to a non-dairying person looking in. The cows are free to move and lie down wherever they like. Issues that we've had going down this pathway is that the technology and design principles are constantly changing. So we've been fortunate enough to go on many farms and talk to many farmers that have gone down this pathway about their experience and what they've gone through and why they've done what they have. A lot of the design concepts from America don't apply over here. They are different. Each farm will be different depending on their prevailing winds, for example. But just as this is a new concept for dairying, it is also a new concept that our local councils have to get their head around. They have to understand why we want to do this, why we want to manage our farms in this way. But with these sort of resources available, they will begin to understand how important it is that we can move down this track and manage our cows in this way. It is actually advantageous to our environment. At the moment, our cows, all their effluent is deposited down along our river flats as they graze. Within the compost barns, 70% of their effluent will be contained in the compost, and 30% will be contained in effluent ponds on the flood-washed feed alley. All of a sudden, we are 100% in control of where our effluent ends up. We can determine now when our effluent is applied to our land. Also, with this form of farming, labour, there's a higher demand for labour, especially if we go 3 times a day milking. So that's better for our local environment. Also, productivity. It's a lot better for our farms to stay as dairy farms than convert to, say, beef farms, where a lot of job losses occur in the support industries in our local community. So one issue that we did have, sorry if you just go back, thanks Karen, is the overcapitalisation of our property. This infrastructure is expensive, and it doesn't actually, our worry was, how much value does it add to the property, and how does that affect bank funding? Also, there's lots of ideas of whether a compost barn will work in our humid environment. But a lot of farmers we talk to, there's lots of levers that we can use, whether it's stocking rate, amount of fill that we bring in, that will alter how the farm or the compost, which is a living system, will work. And then there's always the consumer perception. Cows aren't on green grass, so is this actually better for them? But we're hoping that with resources and by listening to us, we're the ones that live with our cows, that we realise that we need to do this. We need to protect our cows from the extremes weather that we're going to face in the future. So I'm excited about the future of our business and where it's going to go. This will make us a lot more sustainable business, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the industry goes in the next 20 years. Next slide. Thanks for listening to us and listening to the journey that we've gone through. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for sharing your insights and your farm business journey. So next up, we have Clare Waterman, a farm business and economist working with Agriculture Victoria. And today we'll be discussing the economics of contained housing systems. Claire, over to you.
Terrific. Thank you. And thanks for that presentation, Simon. That was fantastic. Thank you. I acknowledge the traditional owners on the land, water and people I'm on today. I'm on Dja Dja Wurrung in central Victoria. And today I'll share some insights from Victoria and New South Wales about some foundational data that we've been tracking around the possibilities of zero grazing systems. The dairy farmers have been making decisions to adapt their farming systems in response to climate change. And in doing so, they face significant risks. That's large capital investment required, but there's also a changing risk profile within the business. And this work that I've been involved with is providing baseline data to help farmers manage some of those changing physical and financial risks when making the transition to zero grazing. I'm Clare Waterman from Agriculture Victoria, and I lead a program of work around farm business economics, and I'm presenting on behalf of the project team for this work. So we're talking about intensive dairy systems. So these facilities are designed and capable of housing cattle for long-term occupation with limited or zero grazing, and they're fed a total mixed ration diet, and I'll refer to them using an acronym TMR in this presentation, and it's fed under a cut and carry system. So in terms of some of the images of these systems, we've got a dry lot, dairy dry lot on the bottom left. The middle is a loose housing or a compost bedded pack, and further to the right is a freestall. And you'll hear more about the specifics of these different systems in following presentations. So today I'll talk about the experiences of those farmers who have transitioned and those that haven't. We'll look at the factors that contribute to making the systems profitable, and a bit of an overview of where to next and work still underway. So farmers setting out on their transition towards zero grazing have been doing so with limited local relevant farm performance information that was specific to Northern Victoria and New South Wales. There hadn't been a baseline information about the possibilities of TMR performance. So in this project, we've heard from the experiences of those who have transitioned. We've examined their performance, we've done an economic analysis, and we've looked at the options to manage risks when making the transition. The results are published on the Dairy Australia website, and they're soon to be published on the Dairy Up website. There's also some recordings of previous presentations on the results. It's important to note that this project certainly is not advocating for one feeding system over another, but rather a source of information for farmers to evaluate their own options and consider the change for themselves. So what are farmers' motivations for making a change, and what was that trigger that made the decision? So AgVic commissioned University of Melbourne to undertake some social research, and the major motivators were found to be increasing water use efficiency as well as managing input variability, among some others. And that trigger that made the farmer make that investment decision and make the transition was around extreme weather events, so in terms of the drought as well as the wet conditions. Challenges around managing hybrid systems, and that last one around a farm succession, so having someone to share their journey with or share their transition with, so either a child or a share farmer. And that was often a reason that farmers didn't progress with their transition. Interviewees described their transition as a progression or an evolution due to a complex range of factors. And this was summarised by a farmer who was quoted as saying, "It's not an actual bang line in the sand, this is before and this is now. It's sort of gradual, but there was a big event last November when our barn got started." And it's important to have this in the back of our minds when we have a look at the data and interpret the farm performance information, because farms still were in their transition phase to the new system. The University of Melbourne was also contracted to undertake social research in New South Wales, and the overwhelming reason that New South Wales dairy farmers were intensifying their feeding system was an adaptation strategy in response to climate variability and extreme events. So again, the wet weather and the drought conditions, and 61% of respondents indicated that that was their highest driver. The social research also looked at reasons why farmers didn't continue with the transition, and one of these was around flexibility. So farms who were operating a PMR, a partial mixed ration diet, or a hybrid system, they said it offered flexibility that they perceived they couldn't get in the TMR, and vice versa. Those farms that were operating as a PMR like to have the consistency and control that they were able to get in the TMR system by transitioning. The large capital requirements was a barrier for some, as well as location, and that was demonstrated by a farmer who was quoted on saying, so they were existing PMR system, and they said that that system had been sound and profitable and fitted the land type and water available to them. So now that we'd established why farmers had transitioned, we looked at their economic performance. In both states, the data was collected using the Dairy Farm Monitor input spreadsheets, and we compared it with their counterparts in the relative states for Dairy Farm Monitor data. The TMR farms have been excluded from the Dairy Farm Monitor sample, so we have two discrete groups of farms when interpreting the results. And when we did have a look at the results, we looked at how profitable the TMR farms were and how did their costs change, and could their higher milk production compensate for the higher total costs. So the results here are for Victoria, and then I'll talk through the New South Wales results. So in Victoria, we had 7 participating farms, 2 were free stalls, 4 were barns, and 1 was a dairy dry lot, and we looked at it over a 5-year period. Profit here is measured by earnings before interest and tax, or as an acronym, EBIT, expressed per kilogram milk solids, and it measures how well the business can generate an income to cover costs. And the costs here are variable and overhead costs. Just to emphasise the high and low returns, each individual farm's represented by a dot, and we can see that range in the data set. So just looking at the lower performances and some of the reasons for that, we had a challenging period over the 5-year analysis period we've got for the Victorian data set, and we had the drought conditions, we had high feed prices, we had high irrigation water prices, and that was across the dairy industry, and the TMR farms certainly weren't immune to those conditions. Farms were in their transition phase during this time, and that can be a vulnerable stage for the business and can also mean lower profits, particularly when the timing of the transition is not perfect. The business can come quite exposed to milk price variability, feed price variability, and we can see lower performance. And many farmers commented that they took gradual changes to intensify their system. And one farm in that 16-17 year, so the first year of our analysis period in Victoria, ended up being within the middle of the sample, so bang on in the middle by the 2021 year, and their improved performance they attributed to moving to these systems. So they had a concrete feed pad and had loafing areas, to later in the analysis period having constructing a shed over it. And they said that they were able to reduce their feed wastage, increase their per cow milk production. They had a drop in cell count, higher milk production, so less lameness, and not losing sections of the pasture where the cows had been milling around. And vice versa on the other end, in terms of the higher performers, some of these farms were operating as a zero grazing system, either weren't in their transition period, but again, some were operating as zero grazing and not among the highest as well. In terms of the comparison with their contemporaries in the Dairy Farm Monitor dataset for Northern Victoria, we can see the average of the TMR farms by the solid orange line, and we can see in most years that was higher than the Dairy Farm Monitor sample, the broken black line. 2018-19 was a particularly challenging year in Northern Victoria. We had those drought conditions, high irrigation water prices, and those high feed prices. And exposure to the purchase feed markets, particularly with high prices, was a feature when we have a look at the New South Wales results as well. Our return on total assets is a business efficiency measure, and it shows the return from the capital invested. And we can use this measure to compare with other investments with similar risk. We calculate it by taking that earnings before interest and tax, or that EBIT we saw on the previous slide, and divide it by the total assets under management. And the data here shows that the participating TMR farms were profitable under the current conditions, and we can see this by the returns being greater than zero and have been increasing in the last 3 years of this analysis period. The TMR farms had higher returns than the Northern Vic Dairy Farm Monitor farms, and that was attributable to the TMR farms being able to attract a higher milk price, and that compensated for their higher feed costs when having a look in comparison to the Northern Vic Dairy Farm Monitor farms. But we also saw the TMR farms had lower returns than the top 25% in all years, and the top 25% here is ranked according to return on total assets. And that was attributable to the top 25% farms having lower feed costs, but mostly due to positive changes in feed and water inventory reserves, as they did have higher cash costs. But this is just average returns, and there were high returns from individual farms within both groups. So for example, in the TMR group, the highest individual performing farm was 13.2%, and the highest dairy farm monitor was 12.7%. So both around 13%, just indicating that many farm system types can be profitable. So moving on to the New South Wales data now, a similar project has been undertaken in New South Wales through a large RD&E project called Dairy Up, and they've got 6 years of data. So thanks to Sheena and Juan, who will join us in the Q&A session, and the rest of the DPI, New South Wales DPI team for providing this info. It is hot off the press. It's only been finalised in the last couple of weeks. The New South Wales dataset is foundational to New South Wales, and there is some noise to be considered. So we can see the number of farms participating increases over the period. There were fewer in earlier years, increasing to 7 by the 1920 year, and had consistently 7 participating farms for the next few years. Farms were in their transition phase, particularly in the first 4 years, but by that 2021 year, all participating farms were considered to be zero grazing. And therefore, it's expected that some of the efficiencies that can be possible in these systems under good management may not yet be fully realised and reflected in the data. And the other consideration is the farms in New South Wales operating across a large geographical area. So thinking of New South Wales, they go border to border, they are predominantly inland, and that has an impact on their milk pricing system as well as their environmental and seasonal conditions. In terms of the range of performance, some of the factors impacting lower performing farms, and here the profit again is measured by earnings before interest and tax expressed per kilogram milk solids. So the lower performing farms, they had lower quantities of homegrown feed available, particularly during the drought years of 1819 and 1920. In the 1920 year, the things had started to improve, but the feed prices were still at historically high levels. And farms in their transition phase, again, may not have fully realised the full benefits of the new system. At the other end, in terms of the stronger performers, some of them are well-established TMR businesses, but just a note here, they are all different. The farmers at the higher end, they secure their homegrown feed base, or they secure a reliable source of feed. And for some, this was around byproducts. Income diversification was a bit of a feature, so they didn't necessarily have the highest milk price, but they did receive a large component from livestock trading or feed and water sales. And they also had high attention to detail. In terms of comparison with the New South Wales Dairy Farm Monitor dataset, they had comparable returns to the New South Wales Dairy Farm Monitor farms, but they weren't as profitable as the top 25% across the 6 years. Now looking at return on total assets for our New South Wales farms, this table is showing the TMR farms have been profitable over the analysis period with returns greater than 0, and they had higher returns than the New South Wales Dairy Farm Monitor sample. But we do need to approach this with a bit of caution because there are differing number of farms between the two samples. There's significantly more in the Dairy Farm Monitor dataset. There are similar number of farms in the top 25% group. They are mostly in the same region, and Juan can talk more to the sample in the Q&A session. So now that we have TMR farm data analysed in the 2 states, Victoria and New South Wales, we can make some observations about their similarities and differences. In terms of milk production, we saw in the social science study that was undertaken by University of Melbourne, we heard farmers were motivated to change to achieve higher production. So they saw the new system were able to offer improved cow comfort, less walking, less feed wastage, among others, and therefore higher milk production. And we saw this reflected in the economic or the physical data. And that was represented in total dollars and per a kilogram of milk solids per cow. Diversified income, so TMR farms had a high and stable milk price, which was due to a flat and year-round supply. However, the makeup of the gross farm income was an interesting observation. So in New South Wales, TMR farms sourced a greater proportion of their income from non-milk sources. So these are livestock trading profit, feed and water sales, or other farm related cash income. So it was about 16% for our New South Wales TMR farms compared to 12% on average for Victorian TMR farms. But there was a big range. So just looking at the Vic farms in the most recent year that we have data for, this non-milk source of income was anywhere between 29 cents up to $2.20 per kilogram milk solids. And for farms in both states, it was a deliberate strategy to manage income risk within their business. In terms of feed costs, the TMR farms in both states spent more on feed cash costs relative to their dairy farm monitor counterparts. And again, this was on total dollars and per kilogram milk solids basis. Of the feed cash costs, a part of this is purchased feed, so things such as bringing in concentrates, hay and silage, and exposure to the purchased feed market, particularly during the drought periods and periods of high feed prices, was cited as a reason for their lower profitability. And when that the timing of their transition was at the same time as exposure to these higher feed prices, their business became quite vulnerable. We saw lower profitability. And securing the feed base, so to manage some of this exposure to the purchase feed market, there was a range of examples of how farmers are securing their feed base. So some of the reasons or the ways, these strategies that TMR farms have put in place was about having at least 2 years of feed in front of them. In Northern Victoria, it was also about building water reserves as this risk management strategy in response to those drought conditions and high prices. Some purchased a byproduct and it was relatively cheap for them, and that was based on their unique location. Others drove their feed production, so a high attention to detail and focus on the quantity and quality of homegrown feed production, and that was on their own farm, or they purchased additional land to grow their own feed. And some cases for Northern Victoria was also meaning they purchased additional water. And lastly, some secured long-term arrangements with local feed and grain suppliers. And so while we've seen these factors in this small data set, we're certainly not advocating for a particular system. We see high profits in all range of farm system types, and consistently profitable farmers are able to manage their own resources. They really understand what drives their own performance and know what's to tweak and what drives their own performance on their own farm. In terms of where to next, our work's continuing. We're doing further monitoring of these systems. We'll do some case study reports on Vic and New South Wales farms and hear from their stories about how they're transitioning and the results that they're seeing. And we'll also look to embed the results within industry tools such as the Farm System Evaluator, and you'll hear from Karen more about that fantastic tool. So in closing, we've heard from dairy farmers who have intensified their feeding system, and they did so to adapt to climate change. They were doing it also for a desire for ongoing farm and business growth. They wanted to manage input variability, labour shortage, and among other factors. But intensification wasn't for everyone, and some dairy farmers didn't further intensify because of a perceived lack of flexibility, large capital requirements, and not having a successor. Through the economic part of the study, we now have a data set of TMR performance in Northern Vic and New South Wales, and this has allowed us to have a look at the factors that are contributing to making these systems profitable. We did see positive returns in each of the years we looked at, but returns were between 2 and 9%. So we had 5 years in Victoria and 6 years in New South Wales. And we saw that the contributing factors or the ways that farms were managing risk within these systems was a strong and stable milk price, and that was particularly the case for Victoria. Income diversification was a deliberate risk management strategy. Farmers focusing on the quantity and quality of homegrown feed, as well as building reserves of feed and water as a risk management strategy for future droughts and high prices, and thereby limiting some exposure to the purchased feed market. And lastly, managing the transition period, which can be a particularly vulnerable stage for some. I haven't touched on it today out of time, but we also had a look at some other overhead costs such as labour, repairs and maintenance and depreciation. And we saw the TMR farms spending more on these in terms of total dollars, but they were comparable to the dairy farm monitor on a per kilogram milk solids basis. And this is indicating that the TMR farms have kept a tight control over these costs relative to production, and we'll continue to look at this in the continuing work. So on behalf of the project team, I'd like to acknowledge and thank those who've made the project possible. We're incredibly grateful for our participating farmers for willingly supplying their information. Thanks to the coordination group, which was comprised of farmers and industry. Thanks to the project team and our investors, Dairy Australia, Victorian Government, New South Wales DPI and Dairy Up. I encourage you to reach out to members of the project team for further information. Thanks.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks for sharing your insights into the drivers and economic potential of the contained housing systems. So next up is Scott McDonald. So Scott is the Dairy Development Specialist with Agriculture Victoria, and we'll be speaking to you today about the importance of the dairy guidelines. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Ashley. Let me just switch the screens. So welcome to the webinar. So I'm talking about the session about dairy guidelines, which you would have recently seen come out a few months ago at a South Australian conference. So why would we write guidelines? So hopefully after 20 minutes, I can explain that to you. So from a dairy perspective, dairy is a grazing industry, will always be a grazing industry. But as Simon alluded to in his presentation, grazing during certain parts of the year, times of the year, is very problematic. So farmers who are looking to graze will build infrastructure. So they will build infrastructure such as feeding, the concrete feed pads, the cattle shelters will come in, a bit of loafing will come out the side. It's very easy for government agency to walk on these farms, and I've been to farms and government agency says this looks intensive farming, it's intensive feeding, it's a concentration of cows. Is this intensive farming? This is not intensive farming, this is grazing. These are facilities that are brought in to the farm to mitigate seasons, to climate, the emergency events like Simon said. They're used infrequently, sometimes till pre-post milking. The occupation varies depending on the time of year, but they're pretty much been brought in for shade, shelter, supplementary feeding and for stock containment to mitigate those issues and those seasonal variabilities. It's important from both the farm's perspective and from government planning agencies who are looking at these through applications to understand the purpose of the facilities, because if the purpose is intention to graze and these facilities aid that grazing farming system, it's different planning completely compared to the other extreme. So people often say, what's the industry going to look like from an intensification perspective? The number's not important, to be honest. So the Australian dairy industry is a grazing industry. Part of the industry will go to intensification based on some of the reasons that Simon alluded to throughout this presentation. So Claire's already outlined it. So in Australia, in the Australian dairy system, there are 3 types of intensive farm systems. So we've mentioned the dry lot, loose housing, which we commonly refer to as the barns, whether they're compost bedding packs or deep litter, and the free stalls, the individual. As Claire alluded to, these facilities are designed not to graze cows. Farmers are not spending a lot of money on these facilities to put cows back out in the hot sun or to walk 5 kilometres or to pug pastures. So they are designed to improve the environment for the cow, improve the farm environment. So cut and carry. Another term which won't be familiar for anyone because it's a coin I use with some of my other clients. There's what we call a consolidated dairy system that is starting to show in Australia. Consolidated dairying is more the corporate farms who are talking to the government agencies, Agriculture Victoria and other states, and basically saying our corporate model in the past has been owning a lot of farms and having a lot of cows, so potentially 1,000 cows on these farms. The logistics of moving labour, moving machinery and production is quite complicated. So we're looking at consolidating our assets to one site. So we will put 5, 10, 20,000 cows on one farm and house those through a series of barns or free stalls. So it's a consolidated dairy, but there's a few of those being proposed in certain states, but most of the industry housing stuff is basically farm sort of stuff. The pictures tell the story. So dry lots are obviously out earthen pens, the compost bedding packs where there's lots of room for cows to move around, and the individual stalls for the feed pad. So we wrote guidelines in 2008, believe it or not. So the first freestall guidelines in the country we started writing in 2008. We finished those in 2010. When we started writing those, there was only 6 freestalls in the whole country. There was no barns, there was no dry lots, hadn't been heard of. So to update the guidelines from 2010 to 2023 took 2 years. So you don't write guidelines just for the fun. It's a large commitment. So not only did it take 2 years to produce these guidelines and transition from the original guidelines, it cost Agriculture Victoria and Dairy Australia over $200,000. The good news is we've used 21 subject matter experts. These are people across the USA, Australia, in Victoria, in agriculture, Victoria, technical fields, who are subject matter experts across all those chapters you see in the guideline. So that those authors were given a fairly strict protocol on how to write these guidelines. They had to submit 3 drafts, which was highly scrutinised by another team of 11 peer reviewers also who are technical specialists in their own right, across engineering, across environmental planning, across farm systems. So you've got 21 experts in their field being scrutinised by another 11 technical specialists. All the material is reference material, so it's not people's opinions or based on their knowledge, it's all reference scientific based material. So a lot of work, so obviously a lot of work produces something that's never been done anywhere in the world. So these guidelines we know are first in the world. We did look and see what other countries were doing, whether we could build similar frameworks and similar guidelines. There's nothing out there, so we started from scratch. So 2 years to transition the guidelines from the Victorian into the national one. To be honest with you, my first thought was, well, the Victorian guidelines are starting to date. We need to update those because things have changed in Victoria. The Environment Protection Act was changing, our planning scheme was changing, our farms were changing. But common sense, and talking to Dairy Australia says, let's just do national because everyone's using the Victorian ones. Let's be bigger and bolder. So thanks to Dairy Australia, they're big and they're bold. They're not designed, as you see, there's 245 pages. They're not designed for you to sit and read from cover to cover. Everyone's at a certain journey, so pick out the chapter that's relevant to you and work your way through them, but don't think you're going to read them overnight. We already have state guidelines, so everyone who works in dairy would know that from an effluent manure perspective or from an environmental perspective, there are guidelines. These guidelines hone down a little bit. So the national guidelines, even though they're universal and have industry outcomes, once you get into the state specific stuff, this is where those national guidelines complement the state codes or guidelines and vice versa. These guidelines obviously talk to the national. These guidelines pick up very specific state requirements, particularly around environment protection. So for example, South Australian effluent guidelines has a lot more attention to groundwater detection, risks to soil profiles because of effluent. So there's specific details in the South Australian effluent guidelines compared to some of the other ones. The good news is that these guidelines, so the Tasmanians, the Victorians, the New South Wales and the South Australian effluent manure guidelines are all currently being reviewed. And so they should. As farmers modernise their farming systems, as things change, industry and government must play a leading role in updating the current guidelines. And I can tell you, I also work across, even though I sit in dairy, I spend a lot of time in the dairy industry, I work across other industries, beef, sheep, camels, alpacas, believe it or not. I can tell you from all the industries I work in, dairy is by far the leading industry in relation to its engineering standards, its designs, in the way it manages its effluent and manure on farms. It is light years ahead because of our farm systems. Very strong environmental footprint. Little trivial fact is that Victoria changed the Environment Protection Act, which was written in 1970 recently. So obviously it needed to be rewritten because it was old. The number one complaint going back to the EPA during the consultation period was that the EPA was referring to effluent from dairy farms as a waste product. It was classified as industrial waste and had its own determination as effluent manure from dairy and livestock industries. Most people complained that it was being referred to by the regulatory authorities as a waste product. It's not a waste product, obviously, in our farm systems. So a bit of the reasons why do we write guidelines. So we've had Feedpad guidelines around for nearly 20 years. So why do we go to the extent of extending those Feedpad guidelines into contained housing? This is the trend of inquiries that have been coming through Agriculture Victoria and Dairy Australia. You can see in the last 13 years, 2016, the world got fairly serious in Australia. The different colours represent the different systems. So blue, free stalls, the reds are the barns and the dry lots. At this stage, we have worked with 171 dairy farmers in Australia who are basically saying we're moving away from the grazing system because of various reasons. I can tell you from working with these farmers that at this stage, 65% of those farmers are opting for a barn type system. They're basically looking at the loafing where the cows are getting anywhere between 12 and 18 square metres each. So they're getting a room to themselves, all this. That's the preferred system choice. Knowing this is quite important because it not only allowed us to strengthen the national guidelines, the Victorian Feedpad freestall guidelines didn't mention compost barns because they didn't exist in 2009 in Australia. Working with these farmers since about 2016 onwards, we figured out barns, managing bedding compost, it was going to be critical in the guidelines. So large chapter obviously on the barns and bedding material. My prediction going forward, right or wrong, is that I think the curve will swing towards more freestalls because farmers will start to discover that managing bedding packs is daily, multiple times each day in certain climates is problematic. I think there will be a bit more balance between barns and freestalls. But farmers' choice in the day. We also know where these farms are because we spend a lot of time talking to them, engaging with the consultants, working with them, talking to various government agencies. So you can see Northern Victoria was always going to swing this way because of the hotter the weather, the flat country, pugging pastures, water prices, highly variable. New South Wales is obviously a big mover, as is Queensland. You can see from the graph, we're getting inquiries and even developments in other parts of the country which we would not think would suit intensification. So you would see Tasmania. Believe it or not, we've got inquiries in Tasmania for freestalls. We're getting barns in southeast Victoria, which is the Gippsland region. So the industry's starting to move. We know there's over 25 reasons why farmers will make these changes. Simon sort of outlined a few of his issues. We know talking to these farms, we talk about their journey. What do you need to achieve? What are you doing now? We know it's high production animals. We know it's genetics. We know it's improved animal welfare. We know there's climatic risks. We know managing pastures is every year is an absolute challenge. So the advantage about knowing where these farms is, it allows us to talk to the planning agencies ahead of the proponents or the farm putting applications in. So a few developments in South Australia at the moment. So we've been talking to the EPA over in South Australia and some of their planning agencies. So we're sort of explaining to them what these systems are. Now, the fact we've got national guidelines now, they can go into the guidelines and see what a freestall is about, trying to guess it. So we talk to the planning agencies before the application goes in to help the agencies understand. We also have a meeting teed up with Tasmanian planning authorities in the next couple of weeks because of developments going down there. So as industry and government, we work ahead of farmers. Our job is to sort of make a smoother pathway, if you will, to navigate the planning. Obviously, we spend a lot of time talking to farmers and a lot of time out on farm. So generally, if people tell us they want to build a freestall, we generally think it's a large herd. As you can see from this graph, from those 171 clients, they are all family farms. There's no corporates in those 101 data set. They're generally starting at 1,000 cows. The general, at this stage, the preferred thinking is that freestalls are in stages, 1 to 4 stages, and there'll be anywhere between 2,000 to 4,000 cows in these freestalls. The smaller herd clients I work with, you can see the most popular one is probably the 500, 800 cow range. That's because that's sort of the medium getting to a large herd. Wet weather seasons tend to impact production a bit more, so they're thinking how sort of stuff. But I have a client who's got 150 cows in a barn, high production animals, and their focus is to mitigate very wet winters and very hot summers. So most of the time they will be living in the barn. Obviously, we keep the details on their production, so we know there's a lot more milk coming. So I've looked at my last 30 farms I've worked with, and I can tell you on these 30 farms, you can see the current herds in blue. The red line says that these 30 farms will increase their herds additional to what they have now by over 22,000 cows. So it sort of starts a conversation about ramp up strategies, heifer rearing, that sort of stuff. My prediction here is that the free stalls will not just be exclusive to the large herds. Free stalls will be used for all size herds. We're getting inquiries now throughout Australia in relation to putting smaller herds in free stalls. Absolutely legitimate. Farmers will use a combination of both. Some will be free stalls, some will be barns. So farmers' choice on what they actually use. This is one of those ones, a graph, which is a scary one. This should have been a very simple planning application in Victoria. This put Victoria on notice, I reckon. So this is a 500 cow dairy farm in Gippsland who were proposing to put 1,000 cows into a free stall. One free stall, transition from 500 cow grazing to 1,000 cows intensive, vertically integrated into milk processing. They put an application in to Shire. So keep in mind, this is 2016, before the world really changed. So the application went in and they had 430 objectors, raising over 600 concerns. You can see from the graph, obviously a lot of concerns are always going to focus around the environment. Effluent, nutrient, waterways is always going to be number one from a planning perspective. Noise, odour issues, you can see on that, concern about animal welfare. I would guarantee of these 430 objectors, 98% wouldn't know what a free stall was, but they just thought it's a big shed, scary, doesn't seem typical of dairy. You can see that 72%, 72 issues were raised around it was perceived to be industrial. So this is one of those watershed moments in Victoria. It wasn't just this dairy one that sort of fell over. There was beef feedlots looking to expand. There was poultry and beef sheds looking to expand in farming zones, and they were getting objectors to the point that the Agriculture Minister says, why can't farmers in farming zone grow and expand their businesses? We need to clear the pathway for farmers to have that rite of passage. So the two big words that you need to understand in relation to if you're going down an intensification pathway, and Clare would touch on this beautifully, is environmental impact statements. Understand what they are and get a full-blown effluent management plan. Talk to professionals. Effluent design, environmental planning are specialised fields. Talk to the professionals, because if you don't, you simply go to casino and roll the dice, I reckon, because you will take on the casino. Same with applications going to council. If you put in half-baked applications and they're full of holes, the agencies, the councils, the EPAs, the water authorities, the CMAs, the environment departments, they will beat you. They will send it back to you and with a whole lot of requests for information. So can't emphasise, don't start the planning journey with a whole lot of issues. Talk to the professionals up front. So if I was to do a survey now and ask people, name an intensive livestock industry, everyone would not mention dairy. Dairy is not intensive. You would say beef feedlots, the pig, the poultry, the broiler, sheep, lambs, feedlotting, they're all intensive industry. They've got their own codes of practice. Every state's got those. There's national codes. If you put an application in for a freestall barn or a compost dairy barn or even a feedpad, a roof feedpad under grazing, local planners and those who are assessing the application are going to download guidelines that are specific to the industry. If they can't find industry guidelines, they're going to the nearest match. We have the current situation in South Australia. There's no planning definition in the South Australia planning scheme, intensive dairy farm. So we've got dairy AMS robotic barns being built in dairy, and the authorities are saying you use the cattle code because you don't have anything else. So Victoria changed in 2018, a critical change. For the first time in Australian dairy history, Victoria introduced a term called intensive dairy farm. So that's basically saying these farms in Victoria, you're going down this pathway. This is your planning pathway. We're breaking you away from the beef feedlots and all the other intensive industries. So the national guidelines are absolutely critical. It explains what these systems are. The effluent guidelines I've already touched on. Victoria is also moving ahead in relation to their writing an intensive livestock code in which there will be a dairy code. That dairy code will bring separation distances for siting these dairy infrastructure. Without those S factors, same as South Australia, they're using the B factor separation codes to place infrastructure. So absolutely critical to make this change. So the farmers we've talked to, we said, by the way, you're intensive. Their feedback was fantastic. You've cleared the pathway, you've set the bar for us. What do we need to do? environment impact statement, effluent plan, work your way through the planning. A word which you've heard me speak, I hate the word feedlot. For just as I've said, from a dairy perspective, don't ever use the word feedlot, because if you use the word feedlot, if it's in your planning application and anyone sees that word feedlot, they're downloading the cattle code. It is a different, more complicated planning pathway, which will probably not end in success. You would notice the guidelines. We spent a lot of time figuring out the title of the guidelines. We do not use the word confined. Dairy cattle are not confined in these facilities. They go from the bedding area, they go to the milking parlour, they go to water, they go to feed, they can go outdoor loafing, they can go get a back scrub if there's that equipment in the shed. They are not confined, they move around the facilities. So hence the word contained housing facility. Don't ever put an application referring to grazing freestall. If you want to confuse a local planner, mention the ultimate housing system in a grazing system is absolute stupidity. It will come back quicker than anything else, because you don't build these facilities to put cows out in the paddock. And I think most farms will find that it's not actually practical anyway. Last couple of slides. So it's not only the industry changing, hence the reason we wrote the national guidelines. Our operating environment in our states, in our industries, community expectations are constantly changing. When I started doing effluent design in the year 2000, the focus on building effluent systems was nutrients. Keep the nutrients out of waterway, use those nutrients to grow more grass, increase fodder. The discussion now coming through from the agencies with the new Environment Protection Act is now you've got to consider human health from effluent and from agricultural activities. Q fever. Is Q fever a risk from farming close to communities? Our farm systems are more complex. Manure systems are becoming a bit more complicated as well. We've got the bedding material fibre to separate. Odour was something generally never mentioned in dairy because we weren't intensive. Odour is coming to the fore now, obviously with these intensive systems. So obviously a lot more work to do. The separation distances is a critical piece of work. For the first time, we've had farmers who've gone down this pathway having a need to export manure from their farm. Farmers have never needed to move manure from their farm to someone else's farm or to another business, because it's always been used on farm, in cropping, in outblocks. We've got farms when through planning who are doing nutrient balances are basically saying because we're putting more cows in these sheds, we don't have enough land. The good news is the Victorian EPA and Ag departments has cleared the pathway, so you can actually export manure from your farm to right up the balance of the nutrients. The agencies are starting to ask about community impacts. So 1 freestall is okay, 2 freestalls next door. Suddenly we've got a whole community of freestalls. What's the cumulative impact of these facilities? That's been discussed. In-house systems with robotics is coming through. The D's, this is the photo of the D's farm. They were asked the question, is this a factory? You've got milking facilities where staff are working, cows living. Is this a factory? So that will determine the fire rating. Common sense, this is not a factory, this is a farming system. So my last slide is guidelines. Hopefully after this presentation you understand why we spent 2 years writing those guidelines. Guidelines are absolutely critical, whether they be national guidelines or state-based guidelines that are industry specific are critical because they allow farmers to grow, modernise their businesses. It provides confidence in the communities and the government planning agencies that the industries is ahead of their game. They're actually modernising their sort of stuff. It protects the reputation and the brands of the industry. And as I said earlier, it's a role that both industry and government must do. They must update the guidelines according to the situation. No one organisation can write a set of guidelines. It is a fairly big effort. In the guidelines, whether they're effluent, environmental or contained housing or feed pads, they should reflect every farm system from a dairy perspective. Whether you're milking 50 cows or 5,000, doesn't matter. The guidelines should reflect your farming practice. Final prediction, it's a world of pain if you're going to make a significant change to your farm, particularly a transition from grazing to intensive, and spending a lot of money without knowing the pathway. Use the guidelines, talk to the professionals, talk to people doing it, get as much knowledge as you can. I think the starting point in Karen's presentation, the farm system evaluator, that will tell you how much pain or basically how easy the pathway going forward. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ash.
Thanks, Scott, and great to see the power of work that's gone into developing those national guidelines. So just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions throughout the sessions, please do pop them in the Q&A chat down the bottom, and we will address them in the panel. So next up is our fourth speaker for the day, Clare Fitzpatrick. Clare is the Director of Progressive Rural Solutions in the Riverina, and we'll be discussing farm planning in the long term. Over to you, Clare. You might just have to bring yourself on off mute and on video, please.
Sorry about that.
That's right. And just reshare your slide. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. So, thanks so much for the introduction, Ashley. Good afternoon, and my name, as stated earlier, is Clare Fitzpatrick. I am a Director of Progressive Rural Solutions, which is a company based in the Riverina in southern New South Wales. Our business was formed in 2019. We work across most states on dairy and intensive animal development, together with other irrigation planning project management. So we assist farmers from a very practical standpoint to undertake assessments and prepare application for projects such as dairy development that you've been looking at today. So my background prior to this business was 16 years in the natural resource management and irrigation survey and farm design area, which included doing environmental impacts and planning applications. So I was a contributor to the national guidelines, and I'm also working with New South Wales on a revision of their state guidelines. I'm a qualified effluent designer, and in case any of the producers are thinking I look a little bit familiar, I also spoke at Raise the Roof last year. So my aim today is to talk to you about a brief description of the development types. Many of these you've seen in previous slides, but I'll probably aim to discuss a little bit in terms of planning and different triggers that may occur as a result of those developments. I'd like to cover all sectors because I'm aware of the fact that there's multiple people that are attending today. So that covers dairy producers, so those that are implementing the change, the council planners and their staff. So those that are approving change across multiple states, municipalities, and each with a different set of planning rules. So it's going to be a little bit challenging. The supporting industry professionals, so those from financiers, agronomists, shed builders and concreters. So these are the people that are helping producers to make change. I'm going to go through some of the planning for these systems and some takeaway tips and suggestions and points for each of the sectors. So you've seen some for the photos from earlier, feed pads. So these are usually a tool considered in pasture or grazing-based systems. So they're smaller scale type developments, generally local. Most of these are requiring earthworks. So there's different types being earthen uncovered in the bottom left-hand corner, which some can be not flood wash feed pads. In the centre at the top, they're concrete type feed pads, which can be scraped or flood washed. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we have covered concrete feed pads. So these generally are flood washed feed pads. The next type is shelters. These are a little bit mickey in the middle. So they're mostly used as a supplement to existing pasture or grazing-based systems. However, depending on the type of year, some of these may be used as a permanent tool for weeks at a time. So to either manage really wet pasture-based systems, so to try and pull cows out of muddy environments, or in our region, in the Riverina and much of New South Wales and Queensland, it's used as a different type of structure, which is to provide shade during extremely hot times of the year. So it's often a permanent infrastructure, and sometimes it could be considered a change in use of the land to intensive, but it will depend on your state and local planning instruments. So depending on the type of structure and the state that you're in, it may or may not trigger a development or construction requirements too. Each of these are differing, which is a little bit difficult to give anyone very clear advice on that. Then there's the contained housing that we've been speaking about throughout earlier presentations. So these always trigger a change in use, but they may also trigger many other requirements. So for example, in New South Wales, if we're looking at contained housing for greater than 800 cows, that'll trigger things like an EPA license and annual reporting. So the different options that you've seen here and others have spoken about before me are dry lots, so pens where manure is scraped and the feed lanes are flood washed. There's mechanical tilling, which occurs on loafing areas. to increase cow beneficial welfare and loafing. There's loose housing systems, like what Simon spoke on earlier. This has bedding management, which occurs twice daily. More often than not, they have flood-washed feed lanes, and solid bedding management is required. And then the big ones, which are freestall barn systems, where cows have stalls to rest in. They have variable types of bedding, flood-washed lanes, and the bedding can vary from sand to mattresses. They're pretty amazing structures for those that have been in and had a look. Many of them I would consider applying for residency in. The way that these systems are operated are outstanding. So the design of the system is quite variable depending on which system it is, and each system may also have different planning considerations and requirements. So in addition to all of this infrastructure that we're speaking about here, which is generally the main driver for change, additional support infrastructure may be included as to support this type of development. So to give you a bit of an overview of what this infrastructure may include, because it's important to consider this in terms of any applications that you may be receiving if you're a council or if you're a producer, to consider what else should be included in any application to council. So things like milking infrastructure and facilities. So often with an intensification of or a contained system, as Simon and Scott alluded to previously, you will see an increase in production, which obviously is an increase in duty of milking systems. So that ages existing infrastructure quickly. So often producers are starting to think about how a new system could be incorporated with what they're looking to construct now. So total years obviously reduces with an increase of throughput within those existing milking parlours. There are also many different types of milking parlours that producers are considering. So things like you can see with the red there, and Scott showed earlier, automatic milking systems or robotic milking systems. In the top right, herringbone dairies, which are not as popular anymore, and then robotic dairies or rotary dairies, which can be robotic as well. So there's a lot of exciting developments in that space too at the moment. So considering things like new dairy locations and its relation to any facility that is best, and also considering whether it may be appropriate to apply for milking facilities in incorporation or conjunction with either a housed facility or a feed pad as it's being proposed and an application is being submitted for. Commodities areas. So with the incorporation or introduction or expansion of a feed pad or a housing system, commodities areas, or kitchens as they're often referred to, need to consider their existing and proposed holding volume for stock. So whether there's enough room to contain silage, grains, forages, all those sorts of things. Included in this is processing equipment. So particularly if we're considering going to a grain processing system for mixed rations, understanding what additional equipment may be needed, which is potentially exempt development, or it may not be, and it should be considered as part of the application. Also, integration and location of the system that's being proposed. So some of the things that need to be thought about in this space is whether or not there is a long distance to be carting and connecting infrastructure, or whether it's close, whether it's better to build new infrastructure at the same time. Some of these things will also impact things like traffic movements with trucks entering in and off farm, but maybe in a different location. And in some cases, it will actually potentially reduce the amount of traffic coming and going from farm if the producers are using the same product on farm and value adding to the system. Things to also consider as part of commodities area is its noise, dust and lighting, because that feed mixing activities can often occur, particularly in winter, across day-night hours. As Scott alluded to also, effluent systems must be considered as part of any application for feed pads and contained housing. Designers should have experience in the type of system that's being proposed, and it should be stated their qualifications in any submission that's provided. Agriculture Victoria has a list of the qualified effluent designers on their website, which is quite easily accessed. Every system is different, and this is because it is dependent 100% on impacts and location of the facility. So things like rainfall, soil types, solid separation, and the volume of wash system and the number of cows. So there's no one size that fits all with effluent system. And there is one thing that I can absolutely promise you, and that is that the effluent system size does not match the size of the dirt from the hole it's dug to build the earthen pad or the barns. Significant input is required from suppliers, geotechnical and soil specialists, farm designers, and agronomists. And it is incredibly important that the system includes factoring in sustainable nutrient use and details on that use. As Scott said earlier, effluent and is a beneficial byproduct, and understanding when, where, and how the application of this byproduct is to occur is a key part of planning for these types of developments. Freshwater requirements. I said that there may have been a question on this a little earlier. So understanding when you're planning for these types of facilities, how much water is required and how available is that water. Things to consider with water availability is the drinking water requirements. If you're going into contained housing, the cooling requirements, understanding how much water is required for cleaning, and that will vary depending on the type of facility and the regularity of the cleaning. How much water is required for feed and rations, together with understanding the storage period that may be considered as part of winter storage if you don't have access to irrigation facilities or the system, and the water quality that may be available. So sometimes we have conversations around this, and just because the water quality is not good enough to drink doesn't necessarily mean that it should be just used for washing. And that's because the water quality can have significant impact on effluent ponds and where you're going to apply that water to farm. And understanding whether or not the site is suitable for long-term water storage. So obviously you can see in these photos that that may be a large earthen dam or potentially water storage within a series of tanks. And more importantly, considering fire control within the system that you're implementing. Now, there are many other things that I haven't covered, and some of these are yards and vet facilities and how they may incorporate within the system, and making sure that there's sufficient capacity to manage sick cattle and normal vet practices in the existing or new areas. Calf sheds, so whether there's existing calf sheds and how they integrate with the new system, or planning for them if they're not already incorporated. Things to consider as part of that, and the maternity barn, if you're including that in a system, is how to manage the bedding and effluent out of these areas. Staff accommodation and facilities. So if there's going to be an increase in staff, where will they live? Will this be on farm? And should it be considered as part of an application for an intensification of the system? We all know how hard it is to find places for temporary accommodation in towns at the moment. Backup generators and fuel, so managing emergency and contingency planning for fires, floods, and other traumatic events. Simon showed just how that can occur earlier. Weather stations. If you're going to be licensed in New South Wales, you are going to need a weather station. Mortality management, and nobody wants to talk about it, but this should be a significant consideration in terms of an intensified system. So whether it's just general mortality management or considering a mass mortality event. And biodigesters, plan the site for the integration of this with the future and understand any triggers with relation to planning and or the EPA. Also understand the risk to surrounds and the changes that implementing a biodigester system may incorporate within an existing or the long-term site plans. And essential services, so things like power, what is required and what upgrades may be needed. Understanding the capacity within the electrical network. Access roads. So will there be an increase in traffic? What sort of traffic will it be? And is the site suitable for access to roads that are able to facilitate those types of traffic movements? And of course, sewage and wastewater treatment plants, and understanding what is triggered in terms of facilities and housing and where that can be located. So you've now seen some of the infrastructure that we consider, and as a dairy producer, they will be considering all of the previous things that we've discussed in incorporation with the main driver being a new feed pad or the housing system. So in most cases, most producers are going to know what is wanted. They've done tours, they've spent years researching it, they've spoken to many other farmers, they've watched webinars and YouTube videos. I've often spoken to people who have been planning systems like this for up to 5 years. So broadly, there is a plan and some sort of idea of what type of development, where maybe a site has been picked out, and they're looking to move to the next stage. Now, in many cases, producers will drop themselves into the local council, or they'll ring somebody about purchasing a shed or a robot. So this is a great time to refer those producers, if they're not aware of it, into the intensive development guidelines and understand what direction they could go in from here. A great way to manage this is for the producer to assemble a team. And the team could include all the people that you're seeing on the screen at the moment. There may even be more, which could include a project manager. We find in working with our clients that the best projects that run the smoothest are ones where there is a great team on board. So plans are discussed generally with the family and business partners, which should include succession plans. Bring in your existing team as a producer, which includes people like your existing agronomist and nutritionalist. And this may also include your financier. So producers should be checking in with them and understanding what their thoughts are and what their skills are in implementing a system like this. They may also have other clients who are operating in the same way and can help them and support them with this transition. Add in some more that are appropriate to your project, and this will nearly always include a surveyor and a designer. And it should be really important that you use people with experience in this area. Earthworks, which are nearly always required, include consideration of effluent ponds, and it should include engaging a geotechnical or soil specialist that understands planning and design of these types of facilities. These people will be needed throughout nearly every stage of your development and the construction. Depending on the size of the system, find and discuss your plans with a planning and/or environmental consultant, particularly one that has experience in dairy and the type of planning application that you seek. It's very important that you can work with this person, as they will need to talk openly and honestly with you about your plans, your team's plans, their processes, and the future operation of the site. So, considering the project in relation to the site, the planning overlays, and the surrounding areas, it's really important to have a look at the resources that are built and natural and check in to see what red flags there may be. Stages. What is the scale and what is currently and what is the plan for the future? Is it one pad or barn? Test your options now. Have a look at where you want to go in the future. Is it 2 barns, 3 barns, incorporation of a maternity barn? What is your end game? Most intensification developments that we're currently working with at this point in time are constrained by odour, so neighbours, groundwater, particularly in South Australia and Northern Victoria and some of the Riverina, and total farming area for nutrient utilisation. For Tasmania and South Australia, things that may impact on it are slope and managing rainfall. We strongly encourage everybody to generate a concept plan that is staged. Look at the whole of development in relation to that site and the surrounds and any constraints that you have. So the concept plan that you're building at the moment will be a consideration of what is being built, the site constraints, and the preliminary reviews that you'll be undertaking. See how this fits into the farm and its future, and how that should also be considered at this stage. These things take time to put together, and we would not encourage a fully detailed development design at this stage. It's an important concept plan to communicate what is being proposed. So meet with the council and planners and engineers for roads and infrastructure. Take some time to introduce and identify what as a producer is being planned and the things that you will need to address in any application that you lodge. This is essentially the producer's opportunity to present the business and the proposal concept. Depending on the type of development, this may include a planning focus meeting, which will include the EPA and other regulatory bodies. Many authorities, which you can see up on the screen, are added to this type of meeting, and it's a really good way for everybody to understand the proposal and identify any of their requirements or concerns with the site and the area at this point in time. As a producer or a consultant, listen and note what is needed, and producers don't freak out at this point. It's very important that councils and other regulatory bodies have an opportunity to review what is proposed at this stage and provide great input into any concerns or things that should be addressed in the application. It's also a great time to check in on expectations of all involved. Intensive development definitely does not happen overnight, particularly where it's designated in New South Wales and or licensed. So understanding the application type and pathway, any further detailed assessments, the format of those applications, and as I said earlier, the timeframes and any referrals. So at this point in time, the producers will generally go home, regather their team, and bring in any others that may be needed. So as you can see up on the screen, there are many potential other assessments that may be required. Some of these may take extensive time to prepare. Things like Aboriginal cultural heritage assessments and reports require consultation, and they can take 6 months to undertake. Title changes can also take extensive periods. So at this point in time, commencing application reports will be your next step. So this will include things like preparing some sort of environmental report, and that will depend on the state that you're in as to what it's actually referred to as. So an environmental impact statement, a review of environmental factors, or a statement of environmental effects. This is a key document, as Scott alluded to earlier. It needs to be made as easy as it possibly can be for everybody to see what it is proposed. It records what is included in the application, what was considered at the time of the application, and provides a level of protection for the proponent and records what actions are required going forward. It also requires and details exactly what is being proposed in each stage if it's a stage development. Things like cow number, effluent volumes, number of staff, traffic, and potential odour generation. Coming out of the environmental report will be a construction management plan, which is used to understand and meet any environmental concerns during construction. Things like waterways, groundwater, and any quality assurance documents will need to be prepared. Following on from this, an environmental management plan will also be generated as a result of an environmental report, which is how the operation of the site will go going forward. It's incredibly important that this is recorded because this will potentially be what governs the site into the future. So, reconsult. This may or may not be needed depending on the development type. Simple feedpads may not need this particular stage. Chat with your neighbours. The chances are they're going to receive or see a notice. It doesn't take much for your neighbours to turn a 1,000 cow feedpad into a 10,000 cow multi-stage freestall barn. Depending on the type of development type, you may need to undertake public consultation. Identify the concerns that are raised and respond to them. And this may include modifying the plan slightly, altering an operations plan, and recording all of the concerns that have been raised. I can encourage you to avoid any objections wherever you possibly can. So the next thing to do is to finalise the documents. Review the planning focus notes and their outcomes, and check the documents for consistency. Review the council and planning checklists and make sure that you've addressed everything. And check against the required guidelines within the national and state and local. And if there's been significant time between your previous consultation and your lodgement, maybe drop your neighbours a line and let them know what it is you're doing and that you're about to submit your applications. So submit your documents, confirm the receipt, and keep an eye out for the emails. Council will request fees, and potentially there may be further requests for information if you're managing the application. This stage takes time. Just because your earthworks contractor has a gap and can do the work doesn't necessarily mean that your approvals will be ready. Planners are rare and they are overloaded at present. It nearly always requires, and any application nearly always requires referral to other departments for comment and any terms of approval. So be aware that this may also need to be presented to a council meeting, and depending on the council's statutory planning requirements and development control plans. Some may also be subject to minister review or considered regional or state significant. We'd like to hope that once you come out the other end of this, with really well-planned application and informed referral authorities, you won't get any surprises and you'll get your conditions of consent. So check these conditions and the timing of these conditions. There may be further approvals required. For example, if you're in New South Wales and you need a water supply work approval for a pump site or a storage dam, you may need to get an additional application for that. Similarly, you may also need an EPA licence. Be aware of those and make sure that you understand when they need to be made prior to or during works commencing. Ensure that the correct plans are stamped and understand that and make sure you understand those plans. Update your project team and then move on to the next phase, which is the building phase. So key messages. So for the producers that are out there amongst us, contained housing or intensification, it is a change in use. Build a knowledgeable team with experience in the type of development that you're proposing. Understand and plan your development and approval process. And prepare a clear and detailed application using the guidelines. Allow time to make this change and don't be afraid to reach out to the industry for assistance. As Simon alluded to, there are plenty of people out there now operating systems of this type who are more than willing to spend time with you. Please don't sell rainbows and unicorns just to get an approval. It won't be your friend in the end. And also, definitely don't order your shed or your robots before you get your planning application in. For the council planners, you can now see that extensive time, research and effort goes into application of this type by proponents and their specialists. Preliminary planning or planning focus meetings with information on your requirements helps enormously, and we appreciate your time that you give us to do that. There is industry support available to you, as Scott mentioned earlier, and the national guidelines are out to help you with this. For the support industries, check out the guidelines. Please don't move things on site. The plan's proposed and approved in this way for a reason. Allow time and plenty of it for applications. This is not as simple as a building permit or a construction certificate. Work with your client's team when requested. You're not being questioned, and the information that you provide allows clear information for the application and construction or operation phase. Contribute with your knowledge and information. We do need your help at all stages. So thanks so much, everybody. Thank you, Dairy Australia, for allowing me to contribute to this. Producers, we hope you can go forward and plan your new system with confidence and clear understanding of the future. Planners, we trust that this provides you with a better understanding of the systems proposed. And supporting services, we're pleased to provide you with a service with a guideline to integrate into your client's needs and requirements and the team that you work with.
Thank you so much, Claire's great presentation and good insights into the high-level planning for these systems. Okay, so we're on to our final speaker for the day, Karen Romano. So Karen is the National Lead for Feeding and Farm Systems at Dairy Australia. She will introduce you to the Farm System Evaluator, a new digital tool that is going to support dairy farmers in making these complex decisions in housing. Over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Ash. Wow, Claire, fantastic information that you presented there, and should really give some farmers and planning agencies some a pathway, I guess, moving forward once you get beyond that consideration phase. So I'm excited to be here today to speak to you about a project we've been working on for some time. But before I get into that, I just wanted to give you a little bit of update about who I am. So I'm the National Feeding and Farm Systems Lead for Dairy Australia, and I'm charged with working on a project which actually sets up information and resources to support farmers who are considering to move to feeding and housing infrastructure. So essentially farm system change. So it's a 4-year project. It was initiated in 2019, and essentially it's been designed to produce world-class science-based actionable information that can assist our industry to move forward when it comes to farm system changes. And with the cohort of presenters that we've had today, some of those items have been showcased to you already. So we've heard about the national guidelines for dairy feed pads and contained housing systems. We've heard about the research that the AgVic and the New South Wales DPI team have conducted into the TMR, the economics of TMR systems. And now I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about another resource we've developed as part of this body of work, and this is the Farm System Evaluator. So the title of my presentation today is about taking the heavy lifting out of infrastructure decisions. And I'd like to say up front that the Farm System Evaluator is a joint project with funding through the Storm Flood Infrastructure Grant from New South Wales Government, Dairy Australia and Agriculture Victoria. So the Farm System Evaluator has been developed to support farmers in that consideration stage. So what am I going to build for my farm system? And in order to show you the relevance of that, I just wanted to share with you the story from a farmer just in near the border in northern Victoria, and that's Mark and Kate Walpole. So they've just gone through a process and commissioned their new system, which is a 2,000 cow freestall. But importantly, they've gone on a journey to get to that phase where they are now in 2023 with the commissioning of that system. That journey involved going to the US to do some research whilst they were over there, preliminary sort of research in this consideration phase. Then they came back and dwelled on that information and were hit by a flood, which was a motivator, causing them to say, yes, we need to make a change because of wet conditions, pug pastures, poor issues with animal welfare. So they went again to the US to look at some other systems, because remember back then at that stage, as Scott alluded to earlier, not many farms had transitioned to these intensive farm systems. After going on that trip in 2017, they actually decided, yes, we actually need to move forward. We've got confidence to invest in a farm system change. And they purchased land to head towards that, spoke to the planning agencies, which Clare has spoken to, went through a process of designing the project. And then from right from the get-go, when they started thinking about this idea to 2020, that was when they were ready to invest. And then further in that process, they went through until the system was commissioned. The reason I'm showing you this slide is it takes years of planning when you're making a farm system change, and the more effort you put into that planning, the fruits will actually result in the end product. Now, this is where the Farm System Evaluator comes in, because what it's done and what it will do for farm businesses and for people working in the space is that actually helps, it's a decision tool, and it helps you assess how ready your farm is to transition to a new farm system change, incorporating at this stage either feeding or housing infrastructure. So whilst the early adopters were required to go to the US and do that extensive research, what we've done here was we tried to capture all that knowledge and thinking into this online tool to actually support farmers when they're going through that consideration stage, to stop the flip-flopping from one system to another, but to give absolute clarity about how ready you are to transition to a grazing type system, infrastructure within a grazing system, or into an intensive system with housing involved. The tool itself, the logic sitting behind it is quite complicated. It's a world first. This hasn't been created or done anywhere in the world. It's been years in the making, and it's required extensive consultation to farm producers or farmers themselves, but also to people working with farmers who have expert knowledge in this space. So this group of people met 2 years ago, and over this journey, we've actually refined the logic and the thinking to build this online resource that will actually help with that consideration phase and give more clarity moving forward. So in short, I guess what I can say about the Farm System Evaluator is it's a game changer. And what it'll do for users when they use it is it'll actually pose the questions through a series of questions and logic that you work through. Is that, have you considered? We want you to know and have all the I's and T's crossed before you go to that stage to meet with planning agencies, to get designs drafted up, or even to invest in that project, that you are absolutely ready to proceed moving forward. So with the Farm System Evaluator, what we've done is we tried to encompass the feeding and housing infrastructure that we're seeing farmers within Australia explore right here and now. So you've heard earlier from Scott about we've got the definitions of grazing animal production and intensive animal production. So the Farm System Evaluator within grazing animal production considers formed earthen feed pads, concrete feed pads, and then our cattle shelters. So they're the red path systems with the clear roof, or you've got solid structures like in the image shown there. And then we cross over to intensive systems. So these systems have no intent on grazing pastures. Animals have the complete ration fed to them daily in the form of a total mixed ration. And the three types of systems that we're seeing, which many of our presenters today have given you insight into, the dairy dry lots, the loose housing facilities, which are your compost bedded pack bedding systems or a deep litter pack, and then of course our freestall systems with sand, mattresses or other type of bedding available as well. The farm system evaluator is developed in 3 stages. So the first stage actually gets you to gets the user to start to think about, well, what's motivating me to make a change? And Simon gave some great visual examples about the motivations to make the system change for his business. Scott's alluded to some as well, and also Clare Waterman's presentation also spoke about some of those drivers and triggers. So it's a change in operating environment. It's wet conditions. It's a change in water policy impacting on the water available to grow your feed base. So you're switching from pasture to a forage-based system. There are many drivers, in fact 25, that we've captured within this tool. And the tool steps you through a process to identify your top 4, because we know that those motivators or triggers are actually aligned to different types of feeding and housing infrastructure. And so we're trying to help guide your thinking. We also need to ask in this stage some high-level questions about your farm system. For example, where's your farm located is critical. In some parts of Australia, we know, for example, a dairy dry lot's not suited. So these questions are filtered through the system to give confidence about whether we're selecting the right type of system to suit our business. The questions that are asked also delve into to what you're prepared to invest as well, because with this tool, we don't want to show things that are off the table. We want to make sure that we're working with the parameters that are important to your business. So once we've gone through a process of identifying what's motivating you if you make a change, understanding a little bit about your current farm system, we can then generate a suitability report to give you a little bit of an insight into what is the most suitable system given the information that you've entered so far. So in this example here, you can see that once they've gone through that thinking, the most suitable system for this person has been identified as a roofed feed pad or a cattle shelter. It's just given a rating for that too, as a 92% suitability, so giving some confidence it's the right one. But more importantly, this tool will actually also offer other options which also may have some suitability to the inputs that you put today. So in this example, we're looking at a concrete feed pad and a freestall, one at 73% and 61%. The tool at this stage will actually tell you which motivators were aligned to the system, and it'll also tell you which ones aren't, what's required to maximise the success, and then things that you need to be aware of. So I guess stage 2, once you've selected which system that you really want to delve into to understand in more detail, that's what happens with the system self-ready assessment. So these, we've actually identified that there's 12 key management areas that are important to consider when you're thinking about a farm system change, which are listed down the bottom here, right through from the cow to the heifer to the feed and water, etc., to milk marketing and so on and so forth. Within each of those key management areas, we've identified about 98 questions in total, some which are asked about your current system to understand how you currently operate your farm, but more importantly, the secondary questions within each of those subject areas ask you questions about the future, so what your system might look like. And the logic in the background helps to calculate readiness to move forward. So you remember at the start of my presentation when we asked the high-level questions in stage 1 to get you in the park. We said it was 92% ready, but when we've delved into more detail here, we can actually understand, right, there are some areas of concern here, and in fact, you as a business are only 75% ready. And then as a user, when you use the tool, you can delve into each of these key management areas, to each of the questions, to understand, well, why did I only get 51%, for example, for effluent management? So it really gives you those deep insights, what you can work on. More importantly, when we get to this stage of the tool, this is the first time where you can actually start to put information into it. So we want you to start to develop a plan about what your new farm system might look like in the future to bring it to life. So this particular plan is a great document, which then you can go and take away to talk to your bank or to your planning agencies or to your farm consultants, so that they actually understand what you're planning to do as well into the future. And then at the final stage of the process with a farm system evaluator is that we identify actions or areas that you need to work on, which are either critical, black or red, which indicates you're not quite ready. So we had 3 of those in those form page that we needed to address. So then we start to go through a process of saying, well, let's develop some clear tasks or actions, how we can mitigate the reason or that's stopping us to move forward. So in this example, there was an issue with milk harvesting. That tells you what the capability is required to fix that, and then you can go through a process of developing actions moving forward to address that. So overall, the farm system evaluator really helps with you in this consider phase, in this upfront stage. What do we do next? What system do we need to build for our farm system change involving feeding and housing infrastructure? But there's a whole lot more work to do, as Claire's just alluded to in her presentation. So we're probably only at this early stage to consider. Then we need to work with our trusted advisors. So environmental planning people such as Clare, Scott McDonald, industry personnel, dip into the national guidelines. All of these resources will help support thinking to move forward and closer to that investment phase in the future. So the Farm System Evaluator is about to go live. You can jump into the link on my screen as of next week. Start to have a play. If you've got any questions associated with it, please reach out to myself or Scott McDonald, and we're more than happy to help you work through those.
I would like to introduce our final panel member, Juan Gargiulo. So he is a development officer with New South Wales DPI and has been working on the New South Wales component of the economic study on contained housing. So welcome, Juan. So if you do have questions, please do keep popping them in the Q&A chat box. We will get to them either during this session or later online. First question I actually have is for Simon. So it's 2 parts, it's going to be for Simon and Clare Fitzpatrick. So just wondering if there was any risk management, risk mitigation done in water security during your planning.
Yeah, so because of our frontage to the Manning River, we have a fairly large water allocation for irrigation. And we've also got some decent dam storage on farm. So yeah, we did look at our water usage. We did a water use budget through the new facility, and then helped us make sure that we could sort of get through it right time. Of course, a lot of the water in the shed is used as well with flood washing and the like. And we do have the ability to put it out through the centre pivot irrigation.
And Claire, just the second part of the question. So barns often need more water security and water security of different types of water. Do you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, so I certainly do. So when we undertake, assessments or applications for these types of developments, water security is a really key important factor. So it's not just about understanding water security, but it's about managing contingency planning for that. So understanding total daily water requirements, monthly water requirements, and annual water requirements, and ensuring that in most cases there's not just one form of water available, but 2. And then obviously in terms of animal welfare management, that there's contingency plans again in a situation where there's complete system failure. So when we lodge applications, they're all things that need to be addressed in any submission that's presented.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I have one question for Scott. So would you recommend a two-bay feed pad or 4-bay feed pad for 800 cows?
Yeah, a good question. It's one of those ones. 800 cows it's that herd size that if you put one continuous feed pad down, they become very long once you start working out the cattle spacing, depending on the breed. So it could range between 0.6 of a metre to 0.76, depending on whether they're a small Jersey or a big Holstein. So once you sort of start doing those dimensions and the pad is very long, that's when you start to think maybe I can put a dual pad in side by side. So split the herd. I've seen the dual pads and I've seen the ones that are like a V shape. So one feed pad slopes this way, one slopes the other way, all coming together for central. So they do work very well. The next question is long-term intention, particularly with a dual pad side by side, is there roofing coming? So putting a roof over an extended, wider dual pad is a bit more problematic. But open air concrete dual pads do work very well.
Great, thank you, Scott. Question for Simon. Have you considered changing to robots?
We have, and it's certainly something we looked at during the planning stage. We won't be doing it straight away, that's for sure. We're going to try to get as much life out of our existing dairy as we can. But yeah, I guess that's one of the reasons why we went for an external feed alley rather than an internal feed alley. That all the cows are in one area, and it's going to be a lot easier to install robots down the track. So yeah, it's certainly something we have considered. Thank you.
Another question for Clare Fitzpatrick and Scott McDonald as well. Will there be an education process for planners and decision makers so they know what the systems look like, what are the expectations, and what documents to use for assessment, i.e. so cattle feedlot code guidelines are not incorrectly used? So maybe Claire, do you want to have a first crack at that one?
I suppose that's probably one of the key drivers for the guidelines development, to be honest. So the guidelines are a really important tool for multi-sector people, and that's probably what's so fantastic about them. So to give you a bit of an idea, chapter 8, chapter 9 of the guidelines show the different types of systems. There's lots of pictures, things that can be referred to in the guidelines. And obviously planners and those assessing developments of this type will be seeking feedback from the proponents or the applicants about the description of the development they're doing. So planners should be able to look at the description provided and compare that in the guidelines together, with being able to, work their way through that. So, and obviously on top of that, there's the regional, your regional and state industry, DPI, Agriculture Victoria, DAF, all those guys are very educated about that. And in addition to that, Dairy Australia is obviously always there for you too.
Definitely scope for planning. So we know there's a Planet course which the local councils can use to get further knowledge around the systems. We probably have a luxury in Victoria, which is sort of not embarrassing, but it's because of the type of dairy. We have an ag services planning panel, so which is AgVic. So there's 4 staff at Agriculture Victoria who are a direct link to all the councils in Victoria. So the councils at any point in time can ring up the ag planning panel to seek advice on any agriculture development, not just intensive dairies, but anything. So we've got the technical brains trust sitting there, so you can actually help local councils navigate whether there's permits involved, what's sort of involved with EIS. I think down the track, we've got the guidelines there now, where we're focusing very much on training farmers and service providers and consultants of the sector. But I think there's a piece at the back end we need to do potentially another course for farmers, for local councils, for the EPAs. We do train them individually in other programs, but I think there is specific around farm systems and planning and sort of stuff, given that dairy is probably moving ahead very quickly in relation to our types of farm systems. We're moving very quick, so it's probably a chance to stop and pause and talk to the local planners and EPAs and catchments and councils, say, this is how we farm. You're going to hear different terms, but it's okay.
Thanks, Scott. Okay, just to pivot back, we've got Karen back online. She had her power cut off at home. So what we will do, I'll hand back over to Karen and just ask everyone else to drop off camera for the moment. Karen, over to you again. So I've got a question for Scott. So is there going to be further research on TMR systems to support planning applications into the future? It is getting more difficult to get through the planning process without the data, i.e. odour and reuse. Well-managed barns, etc. don't smell, but trying to justify siding without data is challenging.
Yes. So believe it or not, we do have a project sitting on the shelf. So we were going to start some intensive odour modelling on about 6 farms in northern Victoria, southern New South Wales pre-COVID. COVID wiped out most of the odour specialists are in New South Wales. So getting them across the Victorian border during COVID was very hard. So yes, we have a very good project sitting on the shelf. We know odour modelling is an expensive project. So we've done a great scoping analysis with Scalexia. So we know that we don't get a few $100,000. To get a few random data sets is of no value. We need robust data sets across compost barns and freestall systems. So we have a project ready to go. It needs to be done over 2 years to get the different seasons. So it's sitting there on the shelf ready to go. It's subject to funding and government priorities investment, but no, absolutely critical, because at the moment we've got S factors, which is a separation distances. It's got a very limited data set from dairy because it hasn't been done. It relies very much on the V sector because very, very much into the odour. It would be great to have some data sampling from actual operating dairy farms that have got these systems been going for a couple of years. The other aspect of the compost is that there's a mentality, as soon as you mention the word compost manure, people just think it's going to smell. Similar conversation with the EPA in South Australia, but they've got to understand that it's in a dairy system where milk is our highest quality product. The compost in these sheds it's not sticky and wet. It is very dry, it's aerated. It is a completely different compost compared to what you see out in the feedlot. So it's a bit of a mentality around compost is not compost, particularly in dairy house systems.
All right, thank you for that answer, Scott. The next question might be for you as well. Is there a tipping point in cow numbers that moves the decision from compost farm to freestall?
That's another good question. I saw that one. I was trying to avoid it, but I'm going to bring Clare in. So warm up, Clare. There was a lot of early thinking when farmers were going into freestalls. It was this, I think it was probably a false sense that you've got to have 1,000 cows, and to make these systems be economically viable, you've got to get between the 3,000 is the sweet spot for these herds. So I'm not sure that's sort of right, but it's bigger than just that. I think if you've got high production cows, and if you've got the farm I've worked with has got 160 cows. They are very high productions, and I've gone through this. And he had 20 drivers, which said he needed to go into a house system. He could have quite successfully gone into a freestall based on all those drivers that were telling him that it's worth his while. So I don't think there was a tipping point. I think there's a lot of things to weigh up, and this is where the farm system evaluator plays a critical role. It weighs it all up. It will tell you whether, based on your herd size and production, all that sort of stuff, whether that's an option. But I don't think there's a magical number that says, nah, this is when you go into a freestall. So Claire might want to comment.
Do you want to add to that, Claire?
This Claire or the other Claire?
I think, Scott, you were directing it to Claire Waterman.
It's you, Claire Fitzpatrick, of course.
I was also thinking Claire Waterman as well as both Claires.
There you go. You need to say which one.
Oh, yeah.
So Claire's and Claire, no way.
Yeah, I can answer it from my perspective. I'm sure Claire Waterman can answer it from an economical perspective. I'm seeing inquiries from 400 cows to 2,000 cows in compost or loose housing systems. So yeah, I don't think there is a magic number in terms of that triggers a decision. I think every decision is made entirely on the site, the situation, and the business. It's there's so many factors that feed into what is and what isn't right. I think every business is different.
And just a comment from me too, with the limited data set that we have for the TMR study, we saw farms in terms of their herd size, I'm just going to look at my other screen, between around 500 cows up to nearly 1,700 cows, and they had high returns. Like, we tried to do a regression analysis, which is fraught with danger, as those things are generally are, and it was relatively flat. So we saw high returns on farm systems of different sizes. So there was no indicator in the limited data set that we had as well.
Okay, thank you for those answers. So this next question might be for Clare, Waterman or Juan. Is there any data regarding the impact on carbon emissions per kilogram of milk solids following conversion?
Yeah, I can take that then direct to Juan. Not yet. This information is coming. I'm really excited to have a look at the data on this. The Victorian Government's particularly interested around farm emissions and understanding emissions profile on farm. And now that we've collected the data through the Dairy Farm Monitor project and storing it in Dairy Base, so the analysis dairy industry analysis tools will now allow us to collect that information and do an analysis on it. So it's coming, not yet available. Juan, you might have something else to comment on.
Okay, really keen to analyze that, yeah, but unfortunately we don't have it yet. So.
Okay, so next question I will pass to Karen. Do the guidelines provide advice on separation distances to neighbouring residential dwellings for various contained housing systems, or is it determined by site-specific odour and noise modelling? So Scott, you might have input on this one as well.
No, I think it may even be Clare Fitzpatrick.
Okay.
I think it might be.
I'll have a start.
Handballing to Clare. Yeah.
I'll have a start. And so at the moment, now the guidelines doesn't contain these information. The guidelines, it's a living document. So we can add this information at any given time. Do we have this information? Yes, we do. It's in Victoria. It hasn't been released. It's been tested, obviously, with a very good consultancy group and other people. So we have new versions of the separation distances for dairy systems, which is giving us a lot better results when you compare a house dairy system to a beef feedlot, obviously. Claire can comment on that in relation to a South Australian development. So we do have improved formulas that again can be applied to each site. Each development, each location is obviously unique. So as soon as that's released in Victoria, it will be put up into the national guidelines. It'll be made available. No, it's Victorian. It applies to universally across Australia. So, Claire, you have a comment?
Yeah, so thanks everyone. I think, yeah, Scott's answered that very well. It's a bit of a difficult situation that we're in at the moment because, yeah, as we've all alluded to, often we've got feedlot guidelines that we're kind of being directed towards in terms of intensification. So in many cases, depending on which state you're in, you have to undertake an assessment in accordance with those guidelines. However, what we're finding at the moment is that most of the regulatory bodies are very happy to receive a technical assessment document putting forward the Agriculture Victoria separation guidelines, which is directly related to dairy, and apply that. But it needs to be a robust document and submission, and to provide more feedback into the probably some technical information in the back of that is that within those types of assessments, it's a little bit difficult. It is definitely site specific in every case, and not only site specific, but receptor specific. So there's many things that feed into the back of it, which relate to number of animals within the site, terrain, topography, and the operation type as well. So yeah, without getting too technical.
Great, thank you, Claire. Another question for yourself, Claire. Have you worked with the water authorities, and how cooperative are they in terms of using existing dams to be enlarged for gathering clay for construction of the barns? Oh, sorry, I think I've missed. Yeah, it might be for Scott.
I'll have a crack and Claire jump in. All the authorities have been very good, to be honest, because they said it's new. They're getting these applications, but they're very inquisitive. They're ringing up and saying, what's a freestyle? What's a barn? What's it mean? How should we progress it? The other states, as I alluded to, South Australia and Tasmania, are saying, well, how in Victoria are you getting these through? They're farmers in farming zones. They have a right to grow, and it's a good thing how you do that. The water authorities, one development, we actually had to encroach on a water authorities buffer. So they have a buffer of 60 metres from their major infrastructure, channels and stuff. Quite easily to able to negotiate, Claire, to work in that buffer. So basically you should do the permeability testing and you show there's no issue. The risk with the sourcing clay, obviously on these flat farms where trying dirts is the premium. In Victoria has what farm dams legislation, which sort of governs how big your reuse systems and farm dams are. So you can't just go and dig a 500 meg hole to source dirt. So it's other legislation will come into play, particularly around fill. But yeah, finding fill is so it often comes into discussion around the slope on these pads, because at 1% it's X amount compared to 2%. So the whole picture is weighed up, Clare, in a lot of the planning sort of stuff, and some of them, the geotechnical stuff, how much fill's required, where's it going to come, is it good quality material, etc.
I suppose, yeah, I'd like to add to that if I could. My experience is very similar to Scott's, and that was actually one of my projects that Scott referred to. I think in terms of being able to, go to them pre-consult, discuss what it is, and go with technical knowledge, that probably comes back a little bit to grabbing geotechnical and soil science, specialists that can help you through that process, together with, detailed or designs that you can discuss with them. I suppose probably one of the other points to just put a bit of a caveat on that response is that if you're referring to existing dams, existing effluent dams may require a little bit more of a consideration in terms of using that clay for construction, and it probably just needs to be considered whether there's any impacts with saline interference with soils and things. But my experience is that if you go with robust and good detailed information, that you're generally supported in utilising those things.
Great, thank you, Claire and Scott. The next question, I'd be interested to see, Simon, if you have any insights on this, and then open it up to the group. Has there been any noticeable impact on fertility following conversion?
Yes, so we're still in the conversion phase, so we don't have that data as such.
Has anyone else got insights on that one?
I can help a little bit. So some of my clients who have completed conversion, they did see a slight check in fertility as the transition occurred, but certainly fertility rates have improved in the barn system. I suppose, all those barns are very well run barns. They work with nutritionalists and really good vet expertise. It's about that team, I suppose. So yeah, I think that be prepared for a slight reduction or an issue with that transition period, and just acknowledge and prepare for it. But yeah, coming out the other end, there's certainly an improvement. So.
And I think you hit the nail on the head with your comment there, Claire, about transitioning. See, once you build the shed, the herd doesn't automatically hit the go button and say, right, we're going to perform at our best. There's a lot to learn in terms of operating the new system. There's considerable knowledge that we can draw upon internationally, which we will start to filter through. But that's an area of work that may be the next space within Dairy Australia and our partners to start to explore is how do we start to operate these systems more efficiently through the use of collars and better feeding? How can we improve our reproductive programs to improve herd performance too? So watch this space. That'll be coming down the pipeline very soon.
Okay, next question I've got for either Juan or Claire. Is there any data available showing economics for the construction of dairy and feedlot feed pads, considering the remote nature of most farms and distance from concrete and building material suppliers?
Yeah, I can take that. And then Juan, you might have something else to add. Yeah, certainly that the intensive systems that we had a look at in our TMR study is not for everybody. So thinking of other system types that would be applicable to other farms and looking at the economics of those. There is resources by the RDP. So I know Murray Dairy has a range of case studies of feed pads and different contained areas for feeding. I think the Queensland also have a range of case studies that have looked at the economics, particularly around the costs and the anticipated benefits from the system. I could probably find the links to those and ask, or maybe I can put in the chat, but there are some resources on that as well. Juan, I'm not sure if you've got something else to add.
Yeah, just to
Oh,
jump
go
in to
Karen.
add to
Yeah.
that first, Claire, as part of the farm system evaluator, we've had farmer stories developed for each type of infrastructure, and those stories show the transition from the consideration right through to the operation phase of the business, and actually provide some estimates on the amount of money that was spent to move into those systems as well. So once you get into the tool, you'll be able to access those. Over to you, Wani.
No, nothing really to add, just those resources, but unfortunately from the data we have, at least from New South Wales, and I think the same from Victoria, it's a high level economic data. We can't answer that question, but probably in those resources, farmers can find more additional information.
And Claire, perhaps just to add, we're extending the economic work across New South Wales and Victoria to collect another 2 years worth of data. So that means we'll have 7 years of longitudinal data for these systems. Another outcome of that particular piece of work will be some detailed case studies about across a couple of farms. So they'll become available in December 2023. So we'll make sure that they're on the Dairy Australia website for people to access as well.
Okay, next question is for yourself, Juan. In regards to the economics, what's the impact of depreciation on TMR farms given the large capital investment?
Oh, thanks, Sash, for the question. So, like, we know that depreciation is the decrease of value of the assets over time. It's a non-cash, but it's important to consider this profitability analysis that we do. We found that in the first 5 years, depreciation was similar between TMRs and dairy farm monitor farms. However, depreciation in TFMP didn't include significant buildings, cost for depreciation for significant buildings. So that issue, we addressed that issue and changed the methodology and updated actually DFMP and the methodology for the DFMP farms and the TMR farms. So in 2021, we already implemented that change, accounting for depreciation of significant buildings. And we saw a higher depreciation for TMR farms in the last year. So I think this is a better methodology, an improvement from the previous one. So that was possible due to this project and allows for a better comparison between systems. And we will continue, as Karen mentioned, in future years, collecting more data and examining this depreciation cost and how those evolve. Sorry.
Thanks, Juan. Next question I've got for Scott. How are the guidelines maintained and kept current?
You say they're a living document, isn't that? The last guidelines, we wrote them as a book, and so you can download the book online, which is sort of good, but then you can't change them. These document is on a format on Dairy Australia's platform that they're updated, so we can move content in and out. So if there's new engineering standards or if planning schemes change, we can move content in and out of the document as we see fit, which is what we need to do. They have to be maintained currently because things are still changing. So it's a living document. There's probably another chapter we've been toying with, Karen and I. There's probably another chapter on operating these systems at the back end. So there's a lot of questions on transitioning is a big chapter. It's going from grazing into the house stuff takes a bit of time. We're hearing 2-3 years of transition. There's more work to be done on the routines, the SOPs, the standard operating procedures across in the system, that sort of stuff. So there's still more work to do. So it's not just one of those moments you pat yourself on the back and say, great job. You've got to keep moving because the industry is moving and we've got to keep moving with them.
Great, thank you, Scott. Next question is for Clare Fitzpatrick. How do we know which system is used for what activity when speaking with farmers?
So I think we might have covered that a little bit in one of the previous questions. So I suppose it's about having a very clear description, receiving that from the farmer or the producer as they're supplying. I'm assuming this is coming from an application or a planning assistant perspective. So yeah, it's about understanding from the farmer what type of system it is in the description, and then obviously asking or referring to the guidelines and seeing what that description is. The guidelines have a great glossary in understanding the terminology that's going to be used by farmers. So it's a good place or a good way to reference it. And then obviously, as I said earlier, industry is also there to help you through that. Unless Scott may have something to add to that too.
No, thanks, Claire. Scott, we just had a question come through. How could we have input into the upcoming revisions of the guidelines?
We're always seeking feedback from the guidelines. So yeah, I said it took 2 years, and we juggled the content and what we need to put into it, how much information. What you see is probably what not you get. There's a lot more information we didn't put in the guidelines because it comes to that point, well, it's an overload, so it's critical. But if people think there's specific information that's missing, or there's a particular chapter, please get in contact with Karen or myself. Absolutely, yeah, they've got to serve the needs of everyone's going forward. So absolutely achievable. The point to add is that once we know the information, we'll identify the best person. So if there's specific information, we'll figure out who's the best subject matter expert. Let's get that person to write the document. So it's identifying the right people to put the information in there. So, but absolutely feedback is welcomed.
Okie doke. So we've gotten through most of our questions for today. Rightio. So before we finish the day, I will ask everyone to access this QR code on their phone and complete our feedback survey. We will also pop the link in the chat. Alicia, if you could please do that. Please take the time to fill it out. It should only take a few minutes. We really do value this feedback. It goes a long way to improving these events in the future. So following this webinar, we will be sending you the recording of the session, a link to all the resources that we referenced today, and the contact details for everyone who's presented today. So to finish up, I'd like to thank all the speakers today for their time and their willingness to share their expertise. I hope everyone online has found some value and can utilise the information that's been presented to support their decisions going forward. So thank you all for your time. Appreciate you sticking with us, and good luck. Thanks.